The earring wasn't hers. That was the first thing Laurel Mackenzie noticed. Not the perfume on the collar. Not the late nights that had been stretching longer and longer through the fall. Not even the way her husband had started laughing differently on his phone calls. Quieter, tilted toward the window like he was protecting something. It was a single gold earring, small and crescent-shaped, sitting at the very bottom of the inner pocket of his winter coat. The kind of pocket you forget exists. The kind of place things fall into and stay for months. She'd found it on a Thursday in November, pulling the coat from the closet to take to the dry cleaner. She held it between her fingers for a long moment. Standing in the front hallway of their house in Oakville, the afternoon light coming gray through the sidelights by the door. She set the earring on the entry table. She took the coat to the cleaner anyway. She picked up their daughter from swimming, and made pasta for dinner and said nothing. That was the beginning. Laurel had been married to Brendan Mackenzie for 11 years. They'd met at a mutual friend's cottage in Muskoka the summer after she finished her nursing degree, and he'd been the kind of man who seemed easy to love, steady, funny in a quiet way, someone who remembered details. He'd remembered she took her coffee with one sugar when no one else had. Back then that had felt like proof of something. She was 38 now. She worked 4 shifts a week at the hospital in Mississauga, a 20-minute drive that she'd been making long enough that her body did it on autopilot. They had a daughter, 9-year-old Chloe, who liked drawing horses and hated anything with mushrooms in it. They had a mortgage and a golden retriever named Biscuit, and a standing Sunday dinner with Brendan's parents in Burlington. They had a life. She told herself maybe she was wrong. She told herself a lot of things in the first week. But Laurel was a nurse. She knew how to pay attention to symptoms. She knew that the worst thing you could do was see something and decide not to see it. She started noticing more. Not looking, exactly. Just not looking away. Brendan worked in commercial real estate, which had always meant occasional evening client dinners, last-minute site visits, a phone that buzzed at strange hours. Nothing that had ever seemed like more than work. But now she watched the way he held his phone face down at the kitchen table. She noticed he'd started going to the gym on Saturday mornings, which he hadn't done in 3 years. She noticed that when she asked how his day was, his answers were shorter, more contained, like he was summarizing instead of sharing. She didn't confront him. She wasn't ready. She needed to know first. Her friend Donna, a woman she'd worked with for 7 years, sharp and no nonsense in the way that people who've been nurses long enough tend to become, was the one who told her to look at the credit card statements. Not because you want to be right, Donna said over coffee in the hospital break room one afternoon, but because you need to stop living in the question. Laurel looked. She didn't find anything obvious at first. No hotel receipts, no jewelry purchases, but there were restaurant charges she didn't recognize, twice a month, sometimes 3 times, places in downtown Toronto that she and Brendan had never been to together, a wine bar on King Street, a Japanese restaurant near the waterfront. Nothing that proved anything, but nothing she could explain either. She mentioned the wine bar casually one evening. Have you been to that place on King, the one with the rooftop? Someone at work was saying it's nice. She watched his face. He said he didn't think so. He didn't think he'd been there. He was lying. She knew it the way she knew when a patient was downplaying pain. Something behind the eyes, a fraction too much stillness. That night, after he fell asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her tea going cold and allowed herself to finally feel what she'd been holding at arm's length for 3 weeks. It was grief mostly. Not anger. Anger would come later. It was the grief of understanding that the life she thought she was inside was not entirely real, that she had been the only one taking it seriously. She cried quietly for about 20 minutes. Then she washed her face and went to bed and decided what she was going to do. She wasn't going to panic. She wasn't going to confront him half-ready, with suspicion instead of certainty, and give him the chance to make her feel like she was being irrational. She had watched women do that. Come at their husbands with questions and walk away from the conversation somehow apologizing for their own suspicion. She wasn't going to be that woman. She was going to be careful. She was going to be sure. And then she was going to decide what she wanted on her own terms. Laurel called a lawyer in December, a family lawyer in Mississauga her colleague had used 2 years earlier. She didn't tell anyone. Not Donna, not her sister in Halifax, not her mother. She just made the appointment, went alone and listened. She came home knowing more than she had when she left. About what the process looked like, about assets and custody and the way these things typically went. She filed nothing, she signed nothing, but she knew. Brendan, in the meantime, was getting worse at hiding it, or maybe he had stopped trying as hard. He came home one evening in January smelling like a perfume she didn't own, and he said he'd been at a work dinner and seemed genuinely relaxed as he said it, which was the part that hurt most. Not the lie, the ease of it. In February she found out who it was. She hadn't been trying to. Or maybe she had, a little. She'd become more attentive to his phone when it was left unattended, never touching it, just noticing. But it was his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, a notification visible on the screen without even having to look hard. A name, Petra, and a message preview that was only 8 words long, but 8 words that were enough. Laurel closed the laptop and stood very still and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the snow on the deck and the bird feeder Chloe had painted at school, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. She knew the name. Not personally, but Brendan had mentioned a Petra Willoughby in passing months ago, a colleague from another firm. Someone who'd been on a project with him. Laurel had barely registered it at the time. She registered it now. She didn't cry that night. She'd already done the crying. This was something quieter, a settling, almost. She texted Donna. I know. Donna texted back, what do you need? Laurel thought about it for a moment and typed, time. She spent March getting ready, not dramatically, not revenge ready in any showy way, just ready. She worked with her lawyer. She gathered documents, their financial records, the mortgage, the account statements she had every right to access. She was careful and she was thorough, because she was a nurse and that was how she did things. She also arranged for Chloe to spend a weekend with Brendan's parents in Burlington. She told them she needed to do some things around the house, which was true in a way. And then she waited for the right moment. She knew about the dinner because she'd overheard a phone call. Brendan on the back deck in the early evening, the door not quite latched, his voice carrying just enough. He thought she was upstairs. She wasn't. She was in the laundry room off the kitchen, folding Chloe's school clothes, and she heard him say the name of the restaurant, Caspian, on Front Street in Toronto, and the word Saturday and then a low laugh that she hadn't heard him use with her in a long time. She looked up the restaurant. It was the kind of place where the lighting was low, and the wine list was long, and people went when they wanted to feel they were somewhere important. She could picture it perfectly. She could picture him reaching across the table, easy and comfortable. A man who had arranged his life so that nothing would interrupt this. She called the restaurant that Wednesday. She spoke to the host, a polite young man, and she told him, calmly, clearly, that she would be sending an envelope to be delivered to her husband's table on Saturday evening around 8 o'clock, and she would appreciate it if it was handled discreetly. She gave Brendan's name and described him enough to be identifiable. The host paused for a moment and Laurel said, it's a legal document, it will take 2 seconds, I'm his wife. Another pause then, of course ma'am, we'll make sure it's taken care of. She thanked him and hung up and sat down at the kitchen table and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Calm. Not the forced calm of someone holding themselves together. Real calm. The kind that comes when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you finally set it down. She called her lawyer Thursday morning. On Saturday Brendan left the house at 6:30. He said he had a work dinner. He'd ironed his shirt, which he almost never did for actual work dinners. He kissed Chloe on top of the head. Chloe was home after all. Plans with Brendan's parents had shifted, and he said he'd be home by 10. Laurel watched him drive away from the front window. She had already dropped the envelope at the restaurant that afternoon. She'd walked in at 2 o'clock in a coat she liked and spoke to the same host from the phone, who'd been expecting her and who had been, she thought, quietly kind about the whole thing. He'd confirmed the reservation and taken the envelope and placed it in a drawer behind the podium. Back home she gave Chloe a bath and read 2 chapters of their book and tucked her in. Then she sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and her phone face up on the table. She was not shaking. She was not second-guessing. She had done all of that already, in the dark, in the months before this one. She thought about the woman she had been 11 years ago, standing at a Muskoka dock with a beer and a sunburn, deciding this man was worth trusting. She didn't blame that woman. She'd done her best with what she'd had. At 8:42, Brendan called her. She let it ring. He called again immediately. She picked up on the third ring. Laurel. His voice was strange, compressed, tight, like he was trying to contain something very large in a very small space. She could hear noise behind him, the ambient sound of a restaurant, other people, the clink of glassware. She wondered if Petra was still sitting across from him. She wondered what his face looked like. Hi, she said, what is this? It wasn't a question, exactly. It was more like he was testing whether the ground was real. It's what it looks like, she said. My lawyer filed on Friday. You've been served. Silence. Then, Laurel, you can't, we need to talk about this. This isn't how you. I think we've talked enough, she said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was. Or rather, I think you've been having a conversation I wasn't invited to, for quite a long time, so I made a decision. That's what those papers are. Can we please, Brendan? She said his name quietly, not harshly. Go finish your dinner. She hung up. She sat in the kitchen for a while after that, the house quiet around her, Biscuit asleep by the back door, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. She thought she might cry but she didn't. she felt something else instead. A lightness she hadn't expected. Something that almost felt like relief, though the grief was still there underneath it, and she knew it would be for a while. Chloe padded into the kitchen in her socks at 9:10, unable to sleep. "Can I have water?" she asked. "Of course, bub." Laurel got up and filled a glass. Chloe sat at the table and drank it slowly, the way she always did, looking around the kitchen with the unself-conscious curiosity of a child who has never needed to explain why she's awake. "You okay, Mom?" Laurel looked at her daughter, the dark eyes, the hair still damp from her bath, the horse drawing she'd taped to the fridge 3 days ago, and she felt something so enormous and so steady that she didn't have a word for it. Love, yes, but also something that felt like certainty. "Yeah, bub," she said, "I'm okay." She meant it. What came after was not easy, it rarely is. Brendan came home that night, and they had the conversation they probably should have had months earlier. Except that it was different now. Because she had the papers and he didn't have the option of denying anything, or minimizing it, or turning it around on her the way she had feared he might. He cried. She had expected that. He said he was sorry. She believed him a little, but not enough for it to matter in the way he wanted it to. Petra Willoughby, she found out later through mutual circles, had apparently not taken it well when she learned that the dinner had ended the way it had. She'd put something on her Instagram, vague and self-pitying, the kind of post that said a lot without saying anything specific, and some of Brendan's colleagues had seen it before she deleted it. The irony was not lost on Laurel. The woman who had spent months being something secret was now performing her heartbreak publicly. She had known he was married. She had been the one pushing things forward, and yet somehow she had positioned herself as a person things had happened to, rather than a person who had made choices. Laurel didn't particularly want to spend energy being angry about that. She had a daughter to raise and a career she was good at and a life to rebuild, and she'd done the hard thing already, which was deciding to see clearly. The divorce took 7 months. There were disagreements, mostly about the house, and there were days that were harder than she let most people see. Her sister came from Halifax in April and stayed for 2 weeks, and that helped more than Laurel had expected. Donna brought food enough times that it became a joke. Even Biscuit, she thought, seemed to sense that something had shifted and decided to take the job of keeping her company more seriously. Chloe adjusted the way children sometimes do. Not easily but honestly, asking questions that adults would have been too careful to ask and accepting the answers with a practicality that was occasionally heartbreaking and often quietly wonderful. She drew a picture in June of herself, Laurel and Biscuit in front of a house, and underneath it she'd written in her careful printing, "Our family." She'd drawn the sun in the corner very large. Laurel put it on the fridge next to the horse. On the day the divorce was finalized in October, she drove home from her lawyer's office, stopped at a bakery she liked in Port Credit, and bought herself a coffee and a butter tart. She sat in her car in the parking lot and ate the butter tart and drank the coffee and watched the people walking past on the street outside. A couple with a stroller, an older man with a small dog, 2 teenagers with their hoods up against the October gray. Ordinary life, all of it. The kind of life that doesn't look like anything from the outside. She thought about the earring. That small crescent, sitting in the pocket of a coat, waiting to be found. In another life, she might have talked herself out of it, put it back, convinced herself she was imagining things. She had been so practiced at giving the benefit of the doubt. She was glad she hadn't. She wasn't naive enough to think this was an ending. She was 38 years old with a 9-year-old and a mortgage and a lot of road still in front of her, and some of it was going to be hard in ways she couldn't predict. But she knew something now that she hadn't let herself know before. She could trust her own eyes. She could look at what was in front of her and call it by its real name. She had done that, and it had cost her something real. Something she'd loved in the way you love things that have been part of your life for a long time even after they've stopped being good for you. But she was still here, and she was whole. She finished her coffee, started the car and drove home.